Hi, this is Paul, and I've got a very special guest today. And I don't often reach out to people, but I've been watching the theology podcasts and been bumping into Glenn on Twitter and some other places, and we have some commonalities. And so I thought it would be really nice to do a randos with him and get more of his story, and that way also sort of introduce him to the corner a little bit more. So I really appreciate you taking the time, Glenn.
I was thrilled to get the invite.
Well, let's begin with where you began, and my stock question for these is sort of where I begin is tell me a little bit about the home you grew up in.
Okay, well, I grew up in New Jersey, little town called Verona, and I was the youngest of six surviving children, five boys and a girl,
Wow.
which means in a lot of ways for me, there were almost two families. There was the older half and there was the younger half.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, it was a suburban area. Grew up in a town where I could walk to school. I walked home in elementary school for lunch and then back for the afternoon. Um, and I guess, academically, I was always, well, let me put it this way. My brothers played football and I played clarinet. Okay. So, so I was not the athlete in the family.
Okay.
Since my brothers like to run around and do ball and things like that, and I could never compete with them, I spent a lot of time as a kid reading.
Okay.
So I that kind of set me up academically. I did well in school academically, although my real love at that point was music.
Okay.
Through high school, I used to say that I graduated from the music room in my high school.
Okay.
Um, I, Mostly instruments, jazz band, but also choir, that kind of thing. So music was really the thing that I loved the most.
Okay.
I went off to college and I knew I wasn't good enough as a musician to actually even perform semi-professionally. So I got there actually expecting to end up in ministry. But
Did you go to church as a kid?
Yeah, well, okay, yeah. I grew up in a well, to call them nominally Catholic would be an exaggeration. My parents dropped me off at church on Sunday morning, and I'd go to church and then go to the CCD classes. And then my parents would pick me up, or when I got a little older, I'd bike home if the weather was decent.
Okay. Did all of your
The,
siblings go to church too, or?
at least through confirmation.
Okay.
And after a confirmation, it was optional. Um,
Uh,
but when I talk about my parents being nominal, or actually that's an exaggeration, they didn't even go to church on Christmas or Easter. Okay,
okay.
so
But why did they send the kids to church? Just free babysitting, or they thought it was
well,
important for kids?
well, they thought it was. I think they thought it was important for kids, and although they were not particularly practicing, uh, I think they thought it was important at that point, at least, for us to be Catholic.
Ah.
Now, interesting sidelight there. My dad, well, my grandfather on my father's side immigrated to the country from what was then Austria, is now Poland. His given name was Chaim Sonnenschein,
Wow.
like Chaim, to life, l'chaim. He
Right,
was
right,
Jewish. He was
right.
Jewish. And
Yep.
Sonnenschein is actually particularly in Austria, but in any German or Eastern European country, Central Eastern European country, they'll recognize it as a Jewish name.
Ah.
So when he immigrated, he translated his name from Chaim Sonnenschein to Harry Sunshine. Uh,
That's a pretty good, that's a kind of a
so
fun translation.
yeah, so Chaim actually comes to English as Harry quite often because the ch is close to an H.
Right.
But he died in a train accident when my dad was five.
Oh my.
And so my dad grew up in a Jewish orphanage in New York. And
Wow.
when he graduated from high school, he absolutely hated the place.
Hmm.
And when he graduated from high school, he didn't want to have anything to do with it at all. So he met my mom on a circle line. And if you're from New York, you'll
Yep.
know what that is.
Yep.
And one thing led to another, and he proposed. And my grandfather, who had also immigrated from Central Europe, said, "You are not going to marry my daughter unless you become Catholic." So
Okay.
he said, well, fine by me. So
Hmm.
he became a Catholic. And as a matter of fact, my born Jewish father taught me the Hail Mary when I was growing
Wow.
up.
I also have my father died in 2013, but 2 years before he died, he had a cousin with a son who had a close friend who was a genealogist, and so they ran a genealogy on the extended family. And I always wondered why my mother's Frisian group in Whitensville, Massachusetts. I had so many relatives on that side and hardly any relatives on my father's side. And the reason was, again, they were in the northern reaches of the Netherlands. They were Jews, and for some reason, my great grandfather sent my great grandfather over when he was 18 to get through Ellis Island and get to Western Michigan in order to bring them over, but only my great great grandfather's nuclear family came. So I don't know what happened back there that separated him. But then when he came to North America in Spring Lake, Michigan, they immediately started attending the Reformed Church in America, the Reformed Church in Spring Lake. And that's sort of how we became Christian Reformed. So these stories of Jews deciding to leave. Oh, it's so complex with Judaism exactly how to talk about it, to leave that religious practice, let's say, and sort of, maybe it was just they didn't want the. So then Spring Lake, the courthouse burned down, and my grandfather and his brother, who were in public school, then basically got to take Anglo names. And so Hartog went to Hiram, and the other Hartog, because they kept recycling names, went to Harm, and so or Hyman went to Hiram, and Hartog went to Harm, and so then they could just get American birth certificates and completely erase the Jewishness of it until some pesky genealogist sort of dug it all up. So that's a super interesting story. So I take it that I mean, obviously I've been doing a lot of 19th century reading, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Habsburg, very Catholic group.
Mhm.
So that does sort of explain some of the wrinkles perhaps of then your Catholic upbringing. But you went to public school, not parochial school.
Yeah, I went to public school. Yeah, all my
Okay.
brothers did.
Okay.
Um, Now, by the way, speaking of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, that's my mother's side of the family.
Ah.
My grandfather was from Moravia, modern day Czechia. My grandmother was the daughter of a Slovak nationalist by the name of Anton Bielik, who was married to a Hungarian noble at a time
Wow.
when the Hungarians were busy trying to destroy Slovak culture through Magyarization.
Okay.
By all accounts in the family, it was sort of a Romeo and Juliet situation. But my great grandfather, Anton, was a novelist and newspaper editor, friend of Leo Tolstoy. Um, part of a sort of pan-Slavic movement.
Okay.
But my great grandmother, her cousin was a guy by the name of Baros Gabor, who was well, when I was in Hungary, I mentioned to them that I had a relative that I guess was kind of well known, and they asked me who he was, and I told them, and they said, "You're related to him?" That would be like me telling you I was related to George Washington. And everybody told me different stories about the different things this guy had done. No two
Wow.
stories overlap because he was involved in so many different things. Outside of the Keleti, the East train station in Budapest, there's a square named after him with a big statue of him in it.
Wow.
So, so when I had to pinch hit for somebody teaching World War One,
Uh-huh.
I ended up using my family history as sort of the setup for how World War One happened.
Wow.
Um,
It, you see, you're fortunate because the genealogist did a study of, because one of the things he did is connect you to, let's say, your most famous, closest relative. You got the George Washington of civilization. I got the Marx Brothers. So
yeah.
there we go.
Well, yeah. The uh, some of the cousins. Well, when Anton was exiled out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and he came over here, some of his kids were actually involved in setting up the Trianon Treaty, which was the equivalent of the Versailles Treaty. It predated it to break up the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So
Wow.
they were actually involved. One of them is a signatory of the Czechoslovak Declaration of Independence. And it turns out that all the various states in Eastern Europe, part of what determined their borders is they wanted to give each of them a nucleus of a rail system. The rail system for the Austro-Hungarian Empire was designed by Baros Gabler, the cousin. So, like I said, I'm just sort of my family history is just sort of all over that area.
So were these stories, especially on now, because stories that get passed down are often they have a valence. I mean, people either brag about them or sometimes they try to forget them, or a few generations later they'll laugh about the shame or the embarrassment. So were these stories sort of passed down with a degree of pride?
We actually had to hunt most of these down.
Hmm.
Um, they're really, I mean, even my parents didn't really know much. They knew a little bit, but not much about the history before that, at least not that they passed on to us. A lot of this ended up being stuff that my brothers and I sort of researched on our own.
Wow.
When,
Why do you think it was sort of forgotten or just neglected or just uninteresting when they got to America? Was it stuff they wanted to leave behind or?
well, my grandparents on my mother's side, my grandparents ran a deli in Astoria. I mean, after a number of other things, the depression and things like that
Yeah.
really sort of knocked the stuffing out of them in a lot of ways. But they did not even teach their native languages to their children
Wow.
because they said, we are in America, we are going to speak English. And besides, in practical terms, if you're running a deli and you're speaking Slovak or Czech or Hungarian or something, nobody's going to come in.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
English and English only.
Yeah.
And so what that ended up doing is, in a lot of ways, it cut off the family from the older traditions. So, for example, um, the one thing I know about is we have certain foods that we have sort of passed down for Christmas at Christmas time. And there are not many of them. We got a lot of cookie recipes from Central Europe, which translation ground nuts and butter. Okay, but the foods that were eaten actually all of them had some sort of symbolic meaning, but it's completely lost. We don't know what they are. My mother knew that there was some kind of symbolism here, but she had no idea what that was. It was
Wow.
literally erased at that level.
Wow. Now, the Catholic church that you went to, did that have any ethnic valence, or was that just sort of, at that point, sort of a mixture in Verona?
We had, I think it was primarily Italian,
Yeah.
but Verona wasn't overwhelmingly Italian.
Okay.
Um, we had a fair number of Irish Catholics too. We had a fair number of Jewish people. So it wasn't a specifically ethnic kind of parish.
Yeah.
Although to put Verona in perspective, the house that they used for Tony Soprano's mother in The Sopranos was on the route I walked to school when I was in junior high.
Yeah, I when I watched The Sopranos, I always sort of watched for notable places in Patterson that I knew. So tell me a little bit about Verona when you were growing up. Like you said, some because in Patterson, so I lived sort of at the edge of Patterson by Haledon, Prospect Park, and when I was growing up, the sort of the white flight was kind of in full mode. People were moving out to Wyckoff, Midland Park. The Dutchmen were kind of abandoning some of their inner city churches and moving to establish suburban churches. Verona was
Verona was pretty stable. We didn't have a
okay.
lot of people moving in or out when I was there. Although if you go there now, it's unrecognizable,
Yeah.
both because the trees are much bigger, and Verona has a lot of trees.
Oh,
But also the ethnic mix is obviously different as you're walking down the street,
yeah.
which is, I suppose, normal. But when I was growing up, things were pretty stable, predominantly white from a variety of different kinds of backgrounds. Again, probably the largest, I think, was Italian,
Yeah.
but we had others. A small number of blacks. Um, there were Hispanics that were in the church in my CCD classes, but they were from a different town. Uh, it's just sort of the way the settlement patterns worked.
What year did you graduate high school?
76.
Okay, so you're about 5 years ahead of me. I graduated Eastern Christian in '81. So okay, okay.
So you graduated from high school a year after I got married.
All right. So let's
I married right out of college.
you
So
indeed you did. All right. Well, let's how did you so you said you went to college. Did what college did you go to?
I went to Michigan State.
Oh,
Um, yeah, out of New Jersey, and I went to Michigan State because I got a scholarship.
oh,
So
in music?
no, it was a National Merit Scholarship. Like I said, I
Oh, okay.
wasn't good enough in music to actually do anything with it, and I knew that, so I wasn't going to head toward music.
Okay.
I mean,
Okay.
I still do it as a hobby, but
Okay. Were you still going to church after confirmation? Were you going to church because you wanted to?
yeah. Now here's where things get interesting.
Okay.
Um, when I was 13 years old, on my mother's birthday, we went to my second oldest brother's house, which was in the next town over in Cedar Grove, who was he was a chiropractor. And when we got there, he started talking to my mom about the Bible. He had run into a group of evangelicals. He was born again at this point, and changed all of his religious outlook.
Yeah.
He and a number of other members of my family or people in our house had actually been experimenting with the occult and things like that. But he ran into this Bible study and he got converted, and he was busy trying to evangelize my mom. Now, at that point in my life, I was one of those people who was looking for something. I
Hmm.
was trying to read up on the occult, but there wasn't a lot available in the Verona Public Library. Thank you very much. So, I mean, I was spiritually interested, and I was
Yep.
more engaged than my more recent brothers had been in this, the next two up. So Barry was talking to my mom about the Bible. I thought, gee, that sounds interesting. So I sat in to listen. My mom walked away. Barry still had an audience, so he kept talking. If you know Barry, you'll understand. And he showed me what the Bible had to say, working in Romans, working in Acts, working in other things. And at that point, I just sort of said, all right, well, this is what the Bible says. Catholic Church taught me to believe the Bible. So this is the truth. And at that point, I shifted toward what we call evangelicalism. Curiously enough, the date was September 19th, 1971, 40 years to the day after Addison's Walk.
Which you probably had no knowledge of when you were 13.
Absolutely not. As a matter of fact, I didn't know the date until this year, I don't think.
So, as a 13-year, it's interesting because I just recently had a conversation with Michael Sartori's father, who also grew up Catholic, and my sense is there were a lot of Catholic to evangelical conversions in those years.
I think so.
Um, and so did you then start going to church with your brother? Or how did you pick then a church to go
I
to?
I finished up the year in CCD. I think. I'm pretty sure I did. But then I started going with my brother. Then he moved to Tennessee, and that was a
Oh.
rather long commute. But by this point, two of my other brothers had come to faith from a totally different direction.
Oh.
And they were attending a Christian and Missionary Alliance church in the next town over in Caldwell. So I started going with them.
Okay.
And, so I've been in a sort of independent Baptist church, Hawthorne Gospel.
Oh,
Uh,
really?
yep, that was where Barry was going.
Oh my word. That's fascinating.
Yeah, under Pastor Bronlin. I still remember the
Okay.
first sermon he preached, in fact, that I heard. Um,
Wow.
then I was in the CMA church for the rest of my high school career. Um, by this point, by the way, my parents started noticing a pattern. Four out of the five of us had become evangelicals, so they started attending uh, the CMA and eventually Presbyterian church.
Wow.
Um, my oldest brother was the one holdout. We prayed for him for over 50 years, and he finally came to Christ a few years ago.
Wow. Wow.
So, yeah, it was quite a long process with him. But in any event, when I got out of high school, I went to Michigan State, and some of the guys in the dorm, we had actually kind of an unusual situation where we had our own independent dorm fellowship. It was
Oh.
sort of like an intervarsity thing,
Uh-huh.
except it was just people in the dorm, and we didn't have any supervisors, just sort of what we did.
Okay.
And some of them were going to University Reformed Church in East Lansing, where Kevin
Okay.
DeYoung would eventually be pastor.
Yep.
Although at this point it was a guy named Tom Stark. And so I started attending University Reformed.
Okay.
And at that, while, and in my freshman year, some of the other guys in the dorm were in Work of Christ, which is a charismatic prayer group.
Okay.
So I was attending the charismatic prayer group and going to University Reformed Church. I decided that the charismatic community really wasn't for me. There were a number of things about it that just did not fit.
Hmm.
And so I really sunk into URC. I worked with the music ministry there. I attended morning and evening services. And at that point, I really became pretty thoroughly reformed in my outlook.
Okay. Okay. So when you, so it sounds like you sort of stumbled into the Reformed camp and then grew within it. And
Right.
okay.
Yeah. John Woodbridge used to say God takes care of babies, drunks, and evangelicals. And I think that was kind of what was going on here.
Um, so where did you meet your wife?
Um, it was in our dormitory. I was I'd been there a year. I'd gone back for my sophomore year, and one of the women that I knew was back too. And I was writing a note on her door. I was looking for Betsy, was
Yeah.
writing a note on her door, and Lynn walked up. And Lynn, you know, uh, introduced herself. I introduced myself, and she folded into the dorm fellowship,
Uh-huh.
pretty much right away. I introduced her to everybody that night at dinner, and then, well, I was not initially dating Lynn, or I considered her a friend. We'd
Yeah.
gotten to know each other,
Yeah.
but the thing that was really critical is at the time I was clinically depressed.
Oh.
I was, I mean, and it was a pretty serious depression. Um, I'd actually, I wasn't suicidal, but I had taken dispassionate looks at suicide. Okay.
Now, had this been a pattern for you, or was this just sort of
S-
in something emerged?
Started probably the earliest bits of it. I think I can date back to my senior year in high school,
Okay.
and it got worse during my freshman year. My sophomore year, it hit really hard.
Hmm.
And Lynn is sort of the opposite of that. Lynn is by nature a happy, joyful person. And I she says I thought she was an airhead. That's not really true. Uh, I did think, though, that she didn't really take things seriously, particularly.
Hmm.
Not that she was dumb or anything, but she
Yeah.
just really didn't take things seriously.
Yeah.
Then one day I walked in and I could tell she was unhappy about something. So I said, what's going on? She said, well,
Yeah.
she got a letter from her friend, and she explained the situation to me. And at that point, something clicked in my head, and I realized that I had been reading Lynn completely wrong, and that I
Oh.
what I was seeing in her wasn't just sort of this, not taking things seriously. What I was seeing in her was joy.
Mm.
something that transcended circumstances. And this is something I had never seen before. I'd never run into
Mm.
this.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm
Mm-hmm.
afraid at that point I was done. You know, um, but at that point, Lynn had something I just couldn't I couldn't look away from it.
Mm. Mm.
And no, Lynn, for her part, will tell you she thought I just didn't know how to have fun. Um, and she actually considered it part of her mission to teach me how to have fun. And this was at a point when she didn't know that I was really interested in her. And by the summer, I
Mm.
knew that I was going to marry her, and she didn't know I was interested in her.
Oh.
Um, but uh, that next fall, we started dating.
Yeah.
We were actually engaged, although nobody knew it, before the end of that academic year.
Okay.
Um, and then I went off in the summer to Norman, Oklahoma to work with Summer Institute of Linguistics, get training with them. That's the scientific arm of Wycliffe Bible Translators.
Yeah.
I was a linguistics major. Um, and when we got back, I told my parents, she told her parents, and yeah, then we started planning the wedding.
Wonderful. What a great story. I love when people have their their courtship stories in their randos, especially when you're still married. Um, after if it's wife one or wife two, the people tend to sort of push them away.
Yeah, it's been 45 years this year.
Wow, congratulations. Congratulations. So you were studying linguistics, so you were thinking about, it's funny because with this very metagelical audience and community we have, it's interesting the different hierarchies. And in many ways, for young evangelicals, foreign missions or Bible translation is kind of that's a high status. You'll be a high status evangelical if you do one of these things. So were you interested in foreign missions?
Nope.
Oh,
I was in the Christian and Missionary Alliance, and the pastor's attitude was that if you were really serious about your faith, you'd become a missionary. If you were a slacker, you'd become a pastor.
oh,
And I thought pastor, but I've never felt any particular call toward missions work. So
okay.
how did I end up in linguistics?
Yes.
Well, the only course I was ever bumped out of at Michigan State was a an honors psychology course. And I wanted to get a social science requirement filled. And I had friends in my Greek class who said, Glenn, you really should take linguistics. You'd love it. So I signed up for an intro to linguistics class. And when I took the to linguistics class, I enjoyed it and I started taking other classes and so on. And the thing about theoretical linguistics, the way you are taught, it's essentially how do you analyze the way languages work? How do you analyze the sound system? How do you analyze the way words are formed and how words change depending on how they're used? How do you analyze syntax? All of those kinds of things. And for me, this was essentially no different from the kind of puzzles and games that I enjoyed playing on my own. And so my
Oh.
degree in linguistics was functionally a degree in game playing.
Oh, wow. Wow. So you really enjoyed it
I
and
really enjoyed it. Yeah. And, to actually get a job, I took a year of programming.
oh, wow. Huh, that's interesting. You also have I mean, because that's really a merger of sort of letters and numbers in some ways. It's
Mhm.
theory, it's mathematical in that it's systematic, and then you were also well that was pretty early on programming. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. I learned Fortran and COBOL.
yeah, yeah, I learned Fortran too, and not a lot of good it does these days.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I mentioned I was planning on going into the ministry,
yeah,
but Tom Stark, my pastor at URC, basically said to me, "Bad idea."
really.
Um, because he said you can't just go to school and go to seminary and get out and think you're going to have anything to say to anybody, because you need some experience in the outside world, outside of academia. He says, suppose, okay, your first church is in uh, Western Pennsylvania, and your first day on the job, an out of work iron worker uh, comes to you with marital problems. What are you going to say to them?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
You go home and
that
have a
can,
fight with your wife and learn something about marital problems. Um,
yeah, well, and that's the thing, So that kind of convinced me not to go to seminary right away.
okay,
So I needed some sort of practical something or another to do, and I thought maybe programming would fit the bill.
okay,
I actually got a job as a tech writer with a small computer company,
okay.
peripherals, in Maryland.
Oh, okay. Now, before we leave the college period, I wonder. So you know something both about Christian. You didn't go to a Christian college. You didn't go to a Bible college after high school, but you did go to a state school which had, and then you participated deeply in, let's say, an evangelical fellowship. If you were to sort of compare and contrast, at least from your perspective, obviously you didn't do both as a student, you did one or the other, what the dynamics are in terms of the formational pressures, because if you go, I would suspect that if you go to a state school and you join, as you did, like this evangelical fellowship, you sort of create I mean, you're different. Um, Whereas if you're, let's say, at a place like Calvin or Wheaton, all of those Christian expectations. I think there are a little difference between Calvin and Wheaton too. I've never been to Wheaton, but there was talk when I was at Calvin. I mean, Wheaton had the pledge and all these things. Calvin, by the time I went, was at least a little bit more in terms of, you're going to be an adult. If you go to church, not go to church, go to chapel, not go to chapel, that's on you. Participate or don't participate. So, do you have any thoughts on those two paths?
Yeah, when I was at Michigan State, the faculty were overwhelmingly not believers,
Yeah.
but they were also not hostile to faith.
Okay.
To put as an example, the head of the religious studies department was a guy named Robert Anderson. And I really liked Robert Anderson. However, he described himself in his own words as a 19th century liberal existentialist with orthodox tendencies. I think translating that into more normal language, he was a neo-orthodox, heavy on the neo.
Yep.
Okay. So he would present, his perspective in class, but he would always pause at key points for the evangelical students to come up and give the counter arguments.
Hmm.
As a matter of fact, my senior year, I went to see him after I'd had all the classes that he offered. My senior year, I went to see him, and he was actually rather disturbed about something. And he said to me, "Where have all the intelligent, articulate evangelical students gone?"
Hmm.
He says, when I'm going through Isaiah and I present Deutero Isaiah, I
Yeah.
pause and wait for a student to come up and say, "Wait a minute, what about this?" And he always let us do it. He always gave us a respectful hearing, but he was saying, "They're not there anymore. What
Hmm.
happened to them?" I mean, it really bothered him. On one level, I wanted to say you scared them off, you know, but
Yeah.
but I was the kind of kid who argued with my teacher in second grade. I have no problem with this sort of thing. But he intimidated. I knew a lot of my friends wouldn't take any of his classes because they were intimidated by him.
Uh,
Um, so but the point being, he allowed space.
mhm.
He allowed space for it. And I never got the sense from anybody that anybody was hostile to me because I was a Christian.
Hmm.
Having said, except other students.
Yeah.
Having said that, um, You are right in that we did recognize that we had something that united us that was different from what the people out there had. We were always open to them. If they wanted to join us, great. We'd love to have you.
Hmm.
But we recognize that you're right, that there is an ethos here that is at variance with the overall culture of the campus. Um, Now, having University Reformed Church there, a lot of Christians, strong Christians there, uh, deep commitment. Um, so your circle is wider than just those you know in the dorm or within a varsity or whatever. You have
Hmm.
others there as well. So all of that, I think, helped. What I used to tell people is that I've had people tell me, I don't want to go to a really big school because I don't want to get lost there. I don't want to, and the thing is, that's not what happens in practice. Because when you're at a large school, no matter what your interests are, there are other people that share them.
Yep.
And
Yep.
you can always find a group. You don't have to, I didn't have to have relationships with all 43,000 undergrads when I was there. It's a lot more now. But I just found a couple of different circles and I moved in and out of those with the people there. And I had good friendships. I had good relationships that way.
Yeah.
So I think there's some real advantages to that. Now, having said that, the ethos in the universities have changed.
Hmm.
They are much more ideologically driven than they used to be. And so I'm not sure what kind of advice I would give now.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
the problem is the same kind of ethos is also invading Christian colleges too. So I don't
Yeah.
know where you go that would be, quote, safe.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
not sure there is anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so you graduate, you get a normal job, you get married, kids come along.
Well, actually, yeah, next step. I'm working for the tech right as a tech writer in this computer company. September rolls around and I'm like, oh, I don't have to go back to school. This is great. I'm glad, I'm glad I'm taking a break. I knew I was going to go back to grad school eventually. Somewhere around November, I started thinking it's time to go back to school. It took me 3 years. And after a little bit of, well, what am I going to study?
Yeah.
I decided that I wanted to go back to pursue Christian education, let's call it.
Okay.
Um, I got involved in a small group hosted by a guy in our church that was going through the works of Francis Schaeffer.
Hmm.
I'd never read Schaeffer before this. And so I developed a real interest in apologetics and worldview and those sorts of things. And so I decided that I wanted to go back, and I knew when I was a kid that sooner or later I was going to get a doctorate of some sort because I'm just academically oriented.
Yeah.
And so I decided to pursue religious studies or something related to it. I talked to one of my mentors from Michigan State, Fred Graham, who was a genuine believer. He was in the religious studies department. Fred is one of the major influences on my life. And he said, well, I had a choice between where he went, Iowa, or Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. I'd sort of narrowed it down to those two. And he said, well, you can either go to a place that'll help solidify your faith, or you can head out to Iowa and work directly on the doctorate. Those are, what it comes down to. I didn't really feel like my faith needed solidifying, to be honest with you, but
Hmm.
I opted for TEDS anyway,
Okay. Yeah.
because at that point, TEDS had a program in Christian thought. It was you pick two areas. One is your major area, one is your secondary area between history, theology, and philosophy of religion. Given that I was coming out of Schaeffer at this point, I decided to do history and philosophy of religion. Then I took my first philosophy of religion course and discovered that, in my not so humble opinion, philosophers can't write to save their lives. And the net result is I ended up with an MA in church history, just straight
Okay.
church history,
Yeah.
working on Reformation era Europe.
Okay.
And from there, I went on to work at my doctorate at the University of Wisconsin, where I had to get a second master's degree, but then my doctorate in Renaissance and Reformation with minors in medieval.
Okay.
Now, I should note that all through this, Tom Stark at Michigan State University Reformed Church was a former InterVarsity staffer, excellent expository preacher. In Maryland, I was in an Orthodox Presbyterian church headed by a guy named Alan Harris, former InterVarsity staffer, excellent expository preacher. I go to Ted's. My wife grew up Lutheran. And she said, we've done the Reformed thing for a while. Can we be Lutheran? I said, sure. So we went to a Lutheran church because she really missed the liturgy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I frankly appreciate the liturgy too. And actually, over the years, I've grown to appreciate it more and more as I've been further and further away from it.
Hmm.
So we spent 2 years there. And then when we went to Wisconsin, she said, okay, I've had the liturgy, but I really need good preaching again. So we ended up at Geneva Chapel at that point. It was a not quite a daughter church of the Madison CRC church.
Oh,
And it was an outreach thing. It was
yeah. Yeah.
an attempted church plant.
Yeah.
And that when I was there, I arrived on the first Sunday. We got a new pastor, Andy DeYoung, who is a former
Yeah.
InterVarsity staffer and excellent expository preacher.
Yeah. Yeah.
When Andy left, he was succeeded by Cliff Badgema, a former
Yeah.
InterVarsity staffer and excellent expository
Yeah.
preacher. I think you're seeing a pattern here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and under Cliff, actually, Geneva Chapel turned into its own independent congregation, now Geneva Campus Church, and I was in the first class of elders there.
Oh, wonderful.
In between pastors, we ran the church ourselves. I did a lot of preaching. We wrote our own church services, things like that. So it was a good training ground in a lot of ways,
Hmm.
and you know, my heart was really in that church. I loved that church.
Wow. It's interesting because that church in the CRC, so the CRC has this network, and of course, no networks are completely flat. There are
Mhm.
the campus ministry of U of M obviously has had a lot of profile and a lot of people, but there have been um, I've every over the years I've just heard little pings from that campus ministry, outside of Madison in that area, and it's interesting, but it never really came on my radar much. It's probably one of these areas that just doesn't get a lot of just doesn't draw a lot of attention to itself in the on the CRC screens. So that's super interesting. But I know Chris what's his last name? Eric Dirksen would know. But it's part of this network of CRCs that are connected to different universities that, of course, there's one connected with Notre Dame that I've been planning to go into. And so there's all these little CRCs that sort of connected to universities. And of course, that particular cohort is getting really stressed with, what's happening in the CRC now, depending on what's been happening in those churches. So that's very interesting that's your CRC. That's your time in the CRC.
Well, not
Uh,
entirely.
Not entirely. Okay, so
Because oh, by the way, I should add, I did my research in Paris. And so for a year, I was Anglican. We went to the St. Michael's, one of the two Anglican churches in Paris.
okay, okay,
Um, and at that point, by the way, that's when the whole liturgical thing really hit me much more strongly.
okay.
And actually, at heart, I really think I'm an Anglican, except I'm not in an Anglican church at the moment. But having said that, when I graduated, um, I actually taught at Calvin for 2 years.
Okay.
So
And what
I was in a CRC there.
what church did you
Frank,
go to?
Boston Square.
Oh, okay. Yep, yep, yep.
Yeah. The Frank Roberts was their Reformation historian, and he
Yeah,
was busy deaning, so they needed
yeah,
somebody to fill in for him, and it was a temporary position. They had to hold it open for when Frank decided to stop deaning,
yeah.
and so that gave me a maximum of 2 years on location.
Oh, what years were those?
That would be 92 to 94.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, so I was in the Dominican Republic those years. Frank Roberts was a jewel. Um, I didn't get him much at the college, but then he had to hop over to the seminary for a little bit of pinch hitting, and so he was a gem. Really
I
enjoyed
really like
Frank.
Frank, and I've got a lot of respect for him.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, so you so all right, so
I
let's
also, but
hear.
while I
Go.
was there, I also got to hang out with Richard Muller a bit,
Oh,
which was an
okay.
absolute hoot.
So I didn't Mueller. So Calvin Seminary at some point decides they're going to do a PhD program, and everybody's like, "Wait, what? Don't all these seminaries do DMins in order to, fill the coffers of the seminary?" But Calvin says, "No, we want to do a PhD." And then of course I've become friends with Nathan Jacobs, who went to their PhD program and subsequently went Orthodox. But he had nothing but respect to say of Mueller. But I've never met him or had any
Oh,
interaction with him.
Muller is absolutely brilliant. And, but along with that, he has got a really, really funny sense of humor.
Hmm.
A pretty snide, frankly, but 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 I just absolutely loved hanging out with him because it was always intellectually challenging, but also a
Hmm.
good time just for laughter.
Yeah. So, im impressions on the CRC from your time, very much in the midst.
Yeah. Um, when I was there, they were just starting the first rumblings of women maybe being elders.
Hmm.
Um, I was in the history department, which was at that point the most liberal department on the Calvin campus.
Yeah.
Um, I did not get involved much with CRC politics, um, in part because Sunshine is not a Dutch name. They wanted to rename me Vandershein. Um, and I found it really interesting that in the faculty conversations, their informal conversations, most of them consisted of working out how different people were related to each other.
Yeah,
Um,
hence the burning of the wooden shoes in 1980. This was a lot of consternation amongst some in the CRC, these patterns.
yeah. Well, so long story short, I don't really, yeah, having not been involved with CRC politics, knowing that I wasn't going to be there long,
Hmm.
um, I I've only observed things from the periphery.
Okay.
So I don't really have strong views on that, even from my time there.
So how did you know you were only going to be there for a little while? And you had
Because
temp.
Frank Roberts was going to be coming back at some point, and I had a
Oh,
maximum of 2 years.
oh, and that was it. So you
If you
knew.
start your third year, they've got to put you on tenure track.
Okay.
So that's sort of the rules in academia. So I knew it was at best a 2 year stint.
Okay. Okay. And then did you move then? Where did you go next?
Well, I was on the job market and I really couldn't buy a job interview my first year.
Mm,
My second year, um, I managed to land 3 interviews. One of them was at Central Connecticut State, which is where I ended up. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that Central had been searching for the same position the year before, but they blew the search.
mm.
Okay.
Yep.
And that's a bad sign. That's a
Yeah.
really bad sign. So when I went in for my preliminary interview, I decided to. This was not a job I was overly interested in. I had some doubts about the school, so I decided to approach the interview a little bit sideways. They asked me, one of the key questions, they asked me, "What are your strengths as a teacher?" Okay. I could have said I'm a really good lecturer because I am. But instead I said, "Well, I'm going to tell them what I'm not good at." He said, "Well, what I think is my real weakness is getting students to talk in class, generating any
Mm,
kind of student discussion. I
mm.
said, I'm at Calvin. I don't know whether all of my students are bloodline descendants of William the Silent, but I can't get them to say anything. And one of the guy, that line got me an on-campus interview because one of the guys said, "Wow, he's relaxed enough to joke." Now, it wasn't that good a joke, but
Yeah,
still,
yeah.
then so I got the on-campus interview, and when I got there, without realizing it, every conversation I had, I brought up exactly the right thing that the person who was
Mm.
talking to me wanted to hear but didn't ask.
Hmm.
So, I mean, it was systematic. It was place after place after place. I
Wow.
would, with the first one, my first night there, I was having dinner at the home of Stan Blavis. Stan was a Polish and Polish American historian. And when I found out about this, I said, "Oh, that's really interesting. There's a guy in Reformation history, Jan Alasko, who I think is absolutely fascinating guy. But the problem is, in order to do him, you need not only English, French, Dutch, and Latin. You need Polish too." Because the guy's from Poland. And I said, I don't know anybody that's got that sweep of languages, but this guy's really important, really interesting. He's
Hmm.
actually a linchpin for a lot. So I'm going on in this. And I found out later that one of the questions Stan was going to ask me is, how do you incorporate Eastern Europe into your teaching of the Reformation? And I
Okay.
gave him the answer
Yeah.
at dinner.
Yeah.
You know, it was that sort of thing was going on literally with everybody I talked to.
Okay.
I got home and I said to Lynn, I probably shouldn't say this, but I think I'm going to get that offer.
Okay. Okay.
And within a week, I did.
All right. And you went
And
there, and was it a good, were you there a while or?
I was there 27 years.
Wow, wonderful.
And I I enjoyed the students. I enjoyed my time with the students. I enjoyed my colleagues. Um, the university itself, I wasn't real happy with the administration, but then again, I suppose no academic is.
That's pretty common.
Um, yeah, I found what I did find is that in most of my classes, I was teaching for one or two students.
Mm,
The
yeah.
the ones that were switched on. The rest of them, great, get what you can. But the
Yeah.
thing that really motivated me were those few students who were really, really interested,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that was enough to keep me going.
All right. All right. So that's where you settled down
That's
and
where, yeah, we had both of my kids in Madison before I went to Calvin.
okay. Okay.
But my kids, for all practical purposes, grew up in Connecticut.
Okay. 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 Um, so what kind of church life?
Um, Trying to find a new church is a little interesting when you don't know the area at all. I
Yeah.
asked one of my colleagues. He recommended a Presbyterian church in Hartford, so we started attending there. And the pastor, a woman, was actually a very good preacher. And shortly after we joined the church, she ended up getting called to teach in seminary homiletics. Then we found out fairly quickly that we were easily the most conservative, read Orthodox people in the church. Um, and when their Sunday school program for the kids fell apart, on top of which there were times when we had to deprogram the kids from what they'd been taught in church, we decided it was time to move. Um, the first year I was there, I went to a 16th century studies conference. And while there, I met a guy who actually worked in a bank in Connecticut, but who was interested in the Reformation.
Hmm.
He was on the flight back to Hartford with me. So we got into a conversation. Our families, he was really the first friend we had in Connecticut. And he was going to First Church of Christ in Wethersfield. It was a UCC congregation. And in New England, UCC tends to stand for Unitarians Considering Christ. Okay. So I would not have gone to voluntarily to a UCC church,
Yeah.
but Bob kept telling me, you really need to come to the church. We got a great pastor, we got a great preacher. And Bob was Orthodox. So we ended up leaving the Presbyterian church and going to visiting the church. And the first Sunday I was there was the pastor that Bob had been under. He was a really interesting guy named Don Morgan. Don had taken the church from a standard dying UCC congregation to membership of over 2,000.
Wow.
He had started off as Unitarian and then became an evangelical, mostly of a Robert Schuller stripe.
Okay.
But he was a great speaker and a great organizer, administrator, all of those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And he just did a spectacular job there. And so I'm going through the line, my first Sunday there, going through the line to greet the pastor, and he looks at me and says, "You're new here, aren't you?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, what's your name?" He said, "Glenn Sunshine." He said, "Oh, you used to teach at Calvin College." You could have knocked me over with a feather. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, how does he know this? Uh, is he reading book reviews in 16th Century Journal? Because I was doing a lot of those. What? And he saw the bewilderment on my face, the shock, and he said, "You had my son Ben in your class."
Oh my goodness. Wow.
So I was like, oh, yeah. And actually, I remembered Ben Morgan, but there's no way I would have connected
Yeah.
the two of them.
Yeah.
Well, so we decided to go to that church. And so when we went to the membership class, we do all this stuff, and then they say, well, we believe everybody has gifts, and we really want people to be plugged in at the church
Yeah.
and involved. And so, what would you like to do here? Now, I'd been talking to Bob, my friend who had been in the church, and I said, I'm going to teach an adult Sunday school class, and they said, great. And then they asked my wife what she was going to do, and she said, well, she wanted to start a children's worship program. They said, awesome, how can we help you?
Wow.
Now, you got to understand, I was more interested in a small church because I thought a small church there'd be more room for me
Yeah.
to engage in ministry.
Yeah.
But it turns out the Presbyterian church wouldn't let me do an adult Bible study, even though I had more theology than most of their pastors did,
Yeah.
because they required you to be a pastor to teach an adult Sunday school, an adult Bible study.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And so, well, so I end up in this huge church, and they're like, you want to do this? Go ahead. My wife wants to do this. Great. What can we do to help?
Wow.
Exactly what I did not expect.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I began teaching Sunday school there. I did an adult Bible study for close to 25 years.
Okay.
Basically, it was pretty close to a seminary level English Bible study.
Okay. Yeah.
And yeah, while there, our church was the church that Jonathan Edwards attended when he went to Yale.
That's an
We
old church.
we were meeting in the new building. It went up in 1761.
Wow.
Okay.
Wow.
So in 2003 was the tercentenary of Edwards' birth. And Yale was doing a big academic conference, and they said to our church, look, you guys ought to do a
Yeah.
conference for the churches.
Yeah.
So I'm a historian. I was put on the committee,
Yeah.
and we got Richard Lovelace, we got Oz Guinness, we got a couple of really good local guys, and our keynoter was Chuck Colson.
Wow. Huh.
So and then they wanted somebody to do something opposite the services. So the people who were attending for the weekend, they could go to a service and go to something else or vice versa.
Yeah.
So they asked me to be the sideshow.
Oh.
And I did something on Jonathan Edwards' worldview. The idea being this is how Edwards saw the world. This is how the way we look at the world has changed, and this is why it's happened. This is
Mm.
why we don't see the world the way Edwards did.
Hmm.
Somebody gave a copy of the tape to Chuck Colson. And Chuck told me later, he said, look, I get cassettes all the time. I never listened to them. But he was heading back to DC and he didn't have anything to listen to in the car, so he slapped the tape in. And a couple of weeks later, I get a note from Chuck saying, now Chuck was not above the polite lie. He said, Of course, I'd heard of you, but I hadn't had a chance to see any of your work. He never heard of me. I mean, let's be real here. But he said, "Yeah, I listened to your talk with great interest. I've listened to it several times. I've had it transcribed." And I'm like, "What?" And then he says, "Would you be interested in collaborating on a project with me?" Now, you don't get a letter like that from Chuck Colson and say, "No, my mama didn't raise no dummies."
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So I got plugged in with a new program he was starting called the Centurions. I was there at the very first residency, the first live training with them in January of 1984. And I've been teaching in the program ever since. It's now called the Colson Fellows.
Oh, wonderful.
I worked a fair amount with Chuck the last 8 years of his life on worldview stuff.
Yeah.
And that really shifted the direction of what I was doing away from Reformation history
Hmm.
toward more worldview and engagement more actively within the church.
Okay.
Um, I started doing pulpit supply too, and that led me to ask my pastor. There were times when I couldn't do it because I wasn't ordained,
Yeah.
and they needed somebody to do the sacrament.
Yeah.
So I asked my pastor. I said, what would you think of ordination for me, just to remove this obstacle
Yeah.
to ministry I might have otherwise?
Yeah.
He said he thought it was a great idea. We called together a number of local pastors, including at that time Sierra Wiley. And so we had an ordination exam, and then I got ordained in February of 2020, just before COVID hit.
In what church were you ordained? UCC?
And no, well, actually, our congregation escaped the orbit of the UCC. We went independent. So I
Oh,
was ordained in the context of an independent congregational church.
okay. Okay.
And that's actually created a bit of a problem,
Yeah.
because when I retired from the university in 2021 and moved to Indiana, it worked. That kind of an ordination worked when I was in Connecticut
Hmm.
because I was in a church. I mean, I wasn't on staff, but I was answerable to the
Yeah.
senior pastor. I had other. I had a community of pastors around me that knew me and that I worked with.
Yeah.
When I got out here, that was no longer the case.
Yeah.
And it feels, frankly, rather awkward to be an ordained minister not in some kind of accountability relationship.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
aside from within my local church.
Right. 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 Well,
So,
and yeah, that's different from, a denomination where
mm,
you are in the Christian Reformed Church. I'm accountable to my local elders, but I'm also accountable at other levels
right,
because it's a big network.
right. So, yeah. So, while I was one of the people I met working with Chuck was a guy named Ken Boa. Ken is, and I've never met anybody like Ken. The guy is absolutely brilliant, and he works in a wider range of areas than anybody I've ever seen. I mean, he does things on, I mean, hardcore science stuff. He's actually trained as a scientist. So Bible science things, apologetics, but also spiritual formation. He does film, he does literature, talks about music. He's right now engaged in a lot of work dealing with beauty. He's got presentations on the best of the Marx Brothers in the world according to Calvin and Hobbes. I mean, the range of things this guy does is utterly astounding. And Ken and I had been talking actually for years about me coming on staff with him. And so in 2021, he said, I think we've got the funding together. Let's do this. So I said, all right, this is it. And that's why I retired from the university to work with Ken. And I left Connecticut both because the cost of living, the tax base, and frankly, the politics were, I mean, not what I want, where I wanted to be. Besides, both my kids were in South Bend. My
Okay.
daughter was
Yeah.
at that time doing a postdoc. She has a degree in Old Testament. She's now a professor at Carson Newman University in Tennessee in Old Testament. And my son had moved out there because when he graduated from college, he couldn't find a job in Connecticut. And jobs out here were really easy. So both my kids were out here. Both of them were engaged. Both were getting married.
Oh, that
And
makes things easy.
yeah, that made this the place to be,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah.
So we moved out of Connecticut and moved in here.
So you mentioned Ken Boa, but you didn't mention the what does he run? Is it an
His
organization?
organization is called Reflections Ministries.
Huh.
Um, you can find him at either kenboa.org, BOA like the snake, or reflections.org.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about the Colson Fel I know nothing about that whole
Ah,
program.
okay, Colson Fellows Program. Chuck started it as a worldview training program,
Okay.
but not just worldview. What he wanted was to teach people worldview, but then also teach them to teach. So in order to complete the program, you had to not just go through all the worldview training, but you also had to get training and teaching, and you had to come up with a 3-year plan for how you're going to use what we've told you. He didn't want people who were there just for curiosity. He
Yeah.
wanted people who were going to engage in ministry. His vision was like he wanted it to be something like Samuel's School for Prophets. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's actually the analogy he used. This is
Wow.
a school for prophets.
Hmm.
Um, it's since changed its focus somewhat. John Stone Street now heads the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, which is now independent from Prison Fellowship. It used to be under the umbrella of Prison Fellowship. Chuck's the only person who could hold the two halves of the ministry together, it turns out.
Mm.
And while in the older days, the focus was on worldview, but it also included film, it included literature, cultural analysis, a whole bunch of things of that sort. Now, because of the way they perceive the need of the hour, as it were, it's got much more what I would describe as a social science focus.
Okay.
You know, they no longer do the films, they no longer do the other kinds of things there, but it's still centered around worldview, uh, engaging the culture, and also developing teaching projects to communicate these things and to, pass them on to congregations and elsewhere.
Okay. Interesting. Interesting. Wow, that brings us pretty much up to date. Do you work full time for Reflections Ministries, or is it an
Well,
adjunct thing, or
that was the original intent, but then they discovered that financial the financial situation of the organization wasn't as stable as they thought it was. There was no malfeasance or anything of the sort. There's nothing of that. But they ran into some accounting problems. They ran into a bunch of other things, and as a result, they've knocked me down to being a contract worker.
okay, okay, okay,
Which is okay. I continue to work for the Colson Center. I've got
yeah,
my own ministry as well, which I started in Connecticut, called Every Square Inch Ministries at eastsquareinch.org. And lately, I've taken up writing on Substack. So that and Social Security is paying the bills.
Well, tell me about Every Square Inch, because of course my tribe will hear that and hear
Right.
Abram Kuyper.
Yep. Yeah. And in fact, the name was inspired by Kuiper. One of the things, okay, I had always thought of myself as really being very left brain because I do the analytical stuff really well.
Hmm.
That's what linguistics was all about. It turns out after some testing, I'm actually right brain dominant, which was a real surprise to me until I started reading more about what Vervaeke has to say about that.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, and the reason why that's important is that when you approach worldview, T.M. Moore, who was the Colson's theological advisor and the original dean of the program, TM told me that I understand better than anybody else he knew how worldview applies across a whole range of things. I could take the worldview thinking and apply it to art, to music, to psychology, to politics, to economics, all of these kinds of things. And that's the right brain talking. And so every square inch ministries, well, and the other thing, as a historian,
yeah,
the thing that I love about being a historian is that everything's got history. And as a result, I could play with anything I wanted to. Um, I mean, I remember I actually posted on Facebook once about having a day where I was lecturing on Augustine's theory of free will. Um, I, I forgot all of the others, but one of them was the anatomy and physiology of fleas. I mean, like I
Yeah,
said, I can play
yeah,
with anything. And by the way,
yeah.
the fleas, it's plague. I'm re I'm really good at plague. Okay. That was the thing that I was best known for on campus was my plague lectures. Um, but 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 so the point being that when we're going into the worldview side, this right brain way of looking at
Yeah,
worldview
yeah.
allows me to play with it in all of these different areas.
Yep, yep,
And
yep.
that's why every square inch.
Okay, okay.
Um, if you actually look at the full quote, the sentence that comes before the every square inch sentence is something like, um, you know, uh, our minds can't be hermetically sealed. Everything connects. That's a really
Mm,
bad paraphrase, but that's what
yeah,
it comes down to. Everything connects. Our minds can't be hermetically sealed.
yeah,
And there's not a single square inch in the whole domain of human experience over which Christ, who is Lord of all, does not cry mine.
yeah.
So this idea of a universal vision that incorporates everything, that's why I picked the every square inch thing, because I like to play with a lot of different things.
Okay, okay, okay. Yeah, I actually picked up I've been reading the Stone lectures just
Mhm.
lately. Just bumped into them again. I thought I should look at those things again. I might make some videos about them. But yeah, Kuiper's so interesting in the way that there's so much downstream from him, but it's it's in many ways not dissimilar to the way certain elements of the CRC treats Calvin. You can be a Kuyperian without actually ever reading any Kuyper at
Yeah,
Calvin College.
yeah.
Um, because it's all just sort of diffused and you get everyone's take on Kuyper rather than spending any time looking at Kuyper himself, who a really remarkable man. I mean, just in
Oh,
terms
yeah.
of the range of things that he did in his life, but and the
Yeah.
impact that he's made going down.
By
Fine.
by the way, as far as Calvin goes, I don't know if this is as true as it used to be when I was working in Calvin studies, but I suspect it is. Calvin is viewed in Calvin studies almost inevitably through Bart.
Really?
Yep. Yep. I actually had somebody asked me about my dissertation
Yeah.
here, a guy who was a Puritan scholar and who actually had some knowledge of theology. And I told him what I had done with my doctorate. And he said, but that can't be in Calvin. It's not in Bart. I mean, that's
Wow.
literally his words. I mean,
Wow.
there is a degree to which within Calvin studies, like I said, I don't know if it's
Yeah.
still true, but 20 years ago within Calvin studies, Bart was the lens you viewed everything through.
Not at Calvin Seminary. That was not the case at Calvin Seminary in the
Well,
80s.
that is good. That is good. Well, and Mueller would have none of that nonsense.
Yeah.
He did not suffer fools gladly.
Well, let's see. Maybe touch on the Pugcast. How did that come about?
Okay, so while I was working in the Centurions program with Chuck, I got a call from a local pastor named C.R. Wiley. And he was doing a conference and asked if I would be willing to come in and be on a panel. So I said, sure. And so I went to his church and I was on a panel with him, met a couple of interesting people while I was there. Then sometime later, he gives me a call and says, let's get together for lunch. I have since learned that anytime Chris says that, he's got something in mind. So we met for lunch and he said, what would you think of starting a theology pub? We can, there's a restaurant in our area, Adams Mill, that would be willing to have us in on Monday nights. so they give us a room and we could do this on Monday nights because Monday nights is a slow night for them. This would be
Yeah.
good for them.
Yeah.
Gives us an opportunity.
Yeah.
So I said, sure, let's do it. I did the idea is to bring in somebody to do a talk and then have Q&A and all of
Yeah.
that over dinner
Yeah.
and drinks,
Yeah.
whatever. So I did the first one. It was called Everything You Know About the Crusades is Wrong. And then we had a number of other people coming in. I did three or four of them on different subjects. We had
Now
a number
he's
of
in
other.
Battleground. Was he someplace else there?
He was in Manchester, Connecticut at that point.
Oh,
So
okay.
he's local for me.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
And then I had another friend who kept telling me I needed to meet this guy named Tom Price, and he kept telling Tom Price he needed to meet this guy named Glenn Sunshine.
Okay.
And so we got together at for lunch at the Corner Pug. More on that later. And so I invited Tom to give a talk at the theology pub, and he did a couple of those as well. And then Adams Mill Restaurant closed. I swear it was not our fault, but but they did close. And so a couple of weeks later, I get a call from Chris saying, "Hey, let's get together for lunch." So I get together with lunch for Chris, and he says, "Well, we don't have a place to do the pub anymore, but it would be great if we could keep in touch with the people who
Yeah.
were coming.
Sure.
So why don't we start a podcast?"
Okay.
So it's a great idea, and we invited Tom in as well.
Yeah.
And the idea was, we distribute the podcast to the
Yeah.
people who were coming, and so we started meeting at the Corner Pug.
Okay.
And that's why it is called the Theology Pugcast.
Okay. All right. All right.
So,
I was curious because it's not a common name for a podcast, but it's sort of clever. So I like
yeah,
it.
yeah.
Makes it.
Well,
I like unique things. It makes it easy to find on YouTube. I could just put in Theology Pugcast, and you guys always come up.
yeah. Well, the thing about this was a pub, but it's the Corner Pug, and it's got pictures of pugs all over the place because
Yeah.
the owners had pugs and loved pugs, and anybody who had pugs could take a picture and bring it in, and they'd frame it and put it up for you. So yeah. And if you listen to our early episodes, well, we only had one mic. We were working around a table. You've got the background music in. You hear us placing our orders. You actually get to know what our drink preferences are. All of these kinds of things. The original shtick was we're sitting around a table in a pub having a conversation, and you can listen in.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But then Chris had connections with Moscow, Idaho, the Doug Wilson Circle,
Okay.
and they picked up the Pugcast for a new podcast network they were setting up.
Okay.
And once that happened, I thought if we were lucky, we'd get 300 listeners.
Yeah. Yeah.
Once that happened, it just exploded.
Yeah. Yeah.
And currently, we're getting something like 15 or 16,000 downloads a week,
Oh, that's good.
and in 60 countries, or VPN locations. I'm not
Yeah.
sure which.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it just exploded. And I'm still rather surprised by this, because our conversations are often done. Well, let me put it this way: we have a Notre Dame PhD student in our church, PhD in philosophy, who described it as an egghead podcast. When
Yeah.
when you get a PhD philosophy student who describes it that way, it's not we're not playing at a very low level here. Um,
No, but I don't think you guys are unscrutable at all. I mean,
well, some of the earlier ones might have been, but in any event, what it said to me was that we've been sort of lowballing the church for a long time.
yeah.
I mean, we deal with serious issues, and we deal
Yeah.
with them at a pretty in-depth level,
Yeah.
and we're getting thousands and thousands of people tuning in. We used to get notes saying, "Hey, look, I don't understand half of what you're saying, but I love listening.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
need to have a dictionary next to me when you're talking." But
Yeah.
we would get comments like that. I think we've gotten better at communicating. But again, what it shows to me is that the church, a lot of people in the church are really hungry for substantive content,
Yeah. Yeah.
and they're not getting it.
Yeah.
which is why they're tuning into us because we're giving them more of that sort of thing over, well, frankly, a pretty wide range of topics.
Yeah. 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 No, I think that's very true. I think that's very true. How did you, I mean, I came on via Annie Crawford, who had been at our Chicago thing. I don't know if you had, I think you
We
might have
had
bumped.
Annie, somehow Tom and Annie connected.
Okay.
And then we invited Annie on. And then since then, I've been interacting with Annie kind of regularly through Twitter.
Okay.
Matter of
Yeah.
fact, we're going to be recording something with Gail Zeldin next week, I believe it is.
Oh, good.
We're going to be doing a three-way.
Oh,
Uh,
good. Oh, you're gonna
yeah,
get the full. I know once you start, yeah, you'll get attention from other TLC
yeah,
ships in the flotilla. So,
yeah. Well, and we had Annie on after the Midwestuary
yeah, yeah,
to sort of give us because I don't think our circles knew anything about your circles.
yeah,
So
yeah,
I thought it would be great to try to connect the two. And since I didn't know anybody else to ask, we had Annie on.
yeah, yeah.
So
No, I think that's great. Um, it's a number of people. I had seen a number of your podcasts before on YouTube, and some of the people in my networks had been watching you. So um, when Annie popped up, she sort of came on because she got involved with Symbolic World crew,
mhm.
and
Yeah.
she had taught a class in Peugeot's Symbolic World, and so that's
Mhm.
sort of how she came on. And Richard Rowland had sent me a message on Twitter, said, "Oh, you should follow Annie Crawford because she's working on this stuff." And so it's kind of how these things sort of bleed together.
Yeah. Yeah. We've since had Pajot on the podcast.
Yep.
I want to get hold of Roland and try to get him on. The guy I'm really after is Martin Shaw, but I have no way of contacting him. So but again, moving into these circles, I think is a good thing. And frankly, I think it would be good for our audience. But to be perfectly honest, most of this it's good for me
Yeah. Yeah.
because I am I am moving in areas much closer to cultural apologetics
Yeah. Yep.
than I have before. I have become absolutely convinced on the importance of story, myth, poetry. We've had Malcolm Guide
Yep.
all of these things because secularism as a worldview is in its death throes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And people are looking for reenchantment, but most of them are looking in all the wrong places, places that are frankly very dangerous.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, the church is still 20 years behind the times and is still operating in a largely secularist mindset.
Yeah.
And the thing that I am really focused on right now is what I would describe as rebuilding the crumbling foundations,
Yeah. Yeah.
where I've got it at this point, I've got it in reduced to two areas. One of them is recovering a sacramental vision of the world.
Yep.
In other words, that the world is not just stuff, it has meaning.
Yep.
And the other is recovering a supernatural worldview,
Yep.
recognizing that the invisible world is real, that along with this, things like prayer, worship really matter.
Yep.
That whole sphere.
Yeah.
And so I am, and you can't get there using the left brain.
Yeah.
You can't get there using the approaches that we've used all along. The thing that drove this home to me is when I was teaching history of Christianity at Central Connecticut State University, the first assignment was read the Gospels of Luke and Matthew and come in prepared to discuss them. What did you find interesting? What did you find surprising? That kind of thing.
Yep.
And, I had always told them up front, first day of class, I would say, okay, all professors have biases. They have a particular angle that they're bringing in.
Yep.
And since we're dealing with the matter of religion here, this can be a kind of personal, touchy subject. You should know where I'm coming from.
Yep.
I'm a Christian, which means that I believe that historic Christianity is objectively true. I won't grade you on the basis of whether you agree with me or not. I really despise professors who do that. but you should know this. Fair is fair. You should know where I'm coming from. So I would have them read that. Basically, if you want to know what Christianity is about, you got to start with Jesus. And then if they didn't bring it up, I would bring up the issue of the resurrection. And I would say to them, okay, look, Christianity stands or falls on the resurrection. Apostle Paul says if Christ wasn't raised, our faith is worthless. Okay. So I'd already disposed of the whole Jesus myth thing. So I would say, okay, so pretty much everybody agrees that Jesus was crucified. The key question is what happened to the body.
Yep.
And there are only a limited number of options. And I would list them and list why I don't think they make sense. And at the end of it, I would say, now, if your worldview, I'd already talked to them about worldview, if your worldview allows for paranormal events, didn't use the word miracle, paranormal events, then that gives you another option. He actually rose from the dead. And given that my worldview is open to paranormal events, that's the one that makes the best sense to me. Your mileage may vary. And I got the sense that the students walked out saying, yeah, you know what? That really makes sense. And then not realizing that if it's true, it made any difference for their lives.
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
And what that said to me is that for that generation, sort of the classical approaches or traditional approaches to apologetics based on reason are not the way you get there.
Yeah.
And this brought me back to Lewis, who had a dual approach to apologetics. He did the hardcore reasoning thing,
Yeah.
but he also had an apologetics of imagination.
Yeah.
And I realized that what Lewis effectively was doing was saying, if you look at Addison's walk, what Addison's walk did is it gave Lewis permission to use his reason because it made Christianity look like something that, you know what? If this is true, this is something desirable. Is it true? Because there is something beautiful. There's something imaginatively beautiful about this.
Yep.
And then you move into then the rational apologetics can really take root. So that's what moved me into this area, realizing that the screaming need for that generation is for something that will touch their hearts before trying to get to their mind.
Mm-hmm.
In my generation, we understood that we argued about truth because if something is true, it makes demands on you. I don't think that's as true as it used to be. For some people, yes, but I don't think it's as true as it used to be. And so this is why my real passion right now is those two areas, recovering a supernatural worldview and developing that kind of sacramental vision that tells you that the world means something. It's not just stuff.
Yep. 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 No, I fully agree. I think that's 100% right. When I look around, I remember one person telling me, this is before the YouTube days, saying, he said, yeah, maybe Jesus did rise from the dead. So what? And it's like, if you put it together that way, that tells me a lot about the rest of how your world works. It'd be like, let's say if I walk in, Florin Road is the major road that this church is. If I walk in Florin Road and a car passes right through me and I get to the other side of the street and I say, that car passed right through me. But so what? It's gonna start twisting in your mind about your categories and about how exactly, but for a lot of people it's just like, so what? It's like,
yeah. And and that was the first thing that was actually my first thought. What you have to do if you're going to reach them is show them why it's relevant to them.
yeah.
And that's an approach,
Yep.
but I'm much more drawn to the imagination.
Yeah.
And seeing beauty in imagination and using that as the doorway.
Yeah.
My gut level tells me that is that's really needed right now. We need to recover that.
Yeah. Yeah.
The other approach, hey, if you can explain its relevance to them, show them
Yeah,
its
yeah,
relevance,
yeah.
great. I think, though, that you're going to have to make them want it to be true
Right,
first.
right. Well, Tim Keller would always say, and he was, he had a pretty dramatic gift of evangelism in a certain way. And one of the insights he always had is people want it to be true. People need to want it to be true before they can actually believe it to be true. And I think that's true. It's also true that generally speaking, you can't for many people today, you can't reason them into a belief that they didn't come to that belief through reason.
Mm.
And so it's simply a different pathway.
Right.
And I think for the vast majority of people, even in sort of the thinky talky sphere, that's part of the reason why it's almost always experience first. And after they've had some kind of experience, it may or may not be a quote unquote supernatural or paranormal experience, but an experience of beauty, an experience of the wholesome. I think that's increasingly a category when I listen to Jordan Hall's
Mm.
conversion. I mean, he was really looking for the wholesome, and wholesome is a really interesting category because it's sort of a low level word that we use, and maybe even some ways for people our age a little bit dismissed. But I think for a lot of younger people who are, especially if they've been living in a space of just it's just full of corruption, even just sort of ubiquitous low level corruption. They're looking for something that just has a sense of it isn't corrupted, and it's not moving in order to corrupt. So much of our culture just moves in order to corrupt, and
Mm.
so that this power of wholesome, I think, is going to be something that really sort of catches people. So
Mm.
no, I think that's very, very true.
Another category for me to add. Thank you. Um,
Well, I've been, as is my case, I've been bothering you for an hour and a half digging into your story. Is there anything you wanted to talk about or questions you wanted to ask me or anything on that vein?
yeah, I'll be honest with you. I'm still trying to figure out this whole TLC thing. Um, uh, I sort of get the concept of conversations, just
Yep,
holding conversations, which I think
yep,
is a tremendous idea.
yep.
And it's something that I I'm really intrigued by, and I'd like to. I'm still trying to figure out how you get a foot in the door. How,
Well, you're doing
how
it
do you actually
now.
begin with this?
You're doing it now. And so historically, the front door. So I said a little bit on the podcast. Jordan Peterson was doing these biblical lectures, and I couldn't. When I was reading comment sections and Reddit threads and all of this, I was getting the sense that something important is happening here because I had seen a lot of people walking away from the church and walking away from the faith and going to yoga or following Sam Harris or some of this stuff. And I hadn't seen a lot of traffic back down those roads. And because of what was happening in 2017 around Jordan Peterson, I began noticing people in the comment threads saying things that gave me the inkling that something's important here. And so I wanted to talk to colleagues about this, and colleagues are like, there's a Canadian psychologist going on for 2 hours on YouTube about the Bible. Why would I watch this? And then if they listen to a little bit of it, it's very much not in their categories, and they're
Right.
like, I'm not interested in this at all. So I wanted to find out. I wanted to look into this. And the only way I could sort of figure out how to do it, because all my usual avenues of pursuing things like there's this listserv in the Christian Reformed Church called CRC Voices. I'd use that for a lot of things, but wasn't getting a lot of traction with Jordan Peterson on that just because most pastors aren't going to listen to 2 hours of Jordan Peterson, at least
Right.
not in 2017. So especially not in the CRC. So I I decided to make a YouTube video. And I was I had never thought of YouTube as a social media platform. I was beginning to understand the power of Facebook, and I didn't wasn't doing anything on Twitter at the time. And I very quickly had just a flood of response from especially my second video. My inbox just filled up immediately of people that they what they and I immediately saw that what they needed was pastoring. They needed someone to sit down and ask them for their story and listen to their story and answer their questions, because I also knew that these people were all over the world, and my first response was sort of, well, try and look for a church. But some people tried, and it was a mess because they go into a church, and how are they going to pick a church? They have no idea what filter to use. Again, because of course, we in the church world know all these filters, and so we sort of wheedle down to this is the kind of church I'm going to look for. Or we already have an established network of people that we trust, and these people will recommend this church, or you've mentioned it a few times,
Mhm.
but they have no idea, and so they show up in churches, or they show up in a CRC church, and they just churches just don't know what to do with them. So I spent a lot of time in 2017, 2018, 2019 just answering emails, talking to people. And at that point, before the pandemic, I found Zoom, which worked fairly well. And so just did a lot of conversations, very pastoral conversations. And a lot of these began getting repetitive because same questions people are asking. And people would ask often to have them recorded so that they could go back and watch them and catch up on all the details, because we never hear everything the first way through. So, and then I had the idea of, well, some of these would be probably pretty good to post on the channel because then other people might benefit from them. And once people saw me talking to other people in that certain way, then they wanted to. So I just threw gasoline on the fire, a fire I was trying to put out, which eventually I saw I can't put out this fire. So more and more people wanted to talk to me. And okay, how am I going to handle this? Well, we started a Discord server, which sort of put more gasoline on the fire. I mean, a lot of my attempts to address things caused more volume, which on one hand, someone might say, well, that's what should happen. But from my perspective, was what I was trying to fix. So eventually, what grew was not, didn't, I couldn't talk to everyone one on one. I just couldn't do it because the internet is too big. So, and you also have this problem as a pastor, that people come into the church and for whatever reason they begin to, whether they're converting or whether they're just kind of finding a community or whatnot, oh, the pastor is my best friend. I can't be the best friend of all of this people. Church is about knitting people together. So I very much move towards how can I knit all of these random people together in a productive way that will at least begin to help them pastorally, because there are a lot of people suffering from depression. And what was phenomenal about the early Jordan Peterson years was nihilism was definitely producing depression in young men. And watching Jordan Peterson videos gave them temporary relief from nihilistic induced depression. I began to see that. And so then I knew that what many of these people actually need are community. And I what I didn't understand was the ins and outs of using the internet for community. So one of the guys that came on early was Grim Grizz, and Grim Grizz just recently did a conversation with Kale Zeldin, which I think if you look at that conversation, there's a lot of clues to the TLC in that conversation, because it was very clear that I had a lot of experience with, obviously, with in-person community in church life, but I didn't have a lot of experience on developing community through the internet. And so what the TLC became was, Grim Grizz called it a flotilla of fire ants. So he had learned that, fire ants, when they get flooded, they all sort of link together to survive the flood. And then when the flood recedes, they go back to their, being terrestrial creatures. So that was his image of what was happening around us, because we were sort of using the internet in this time of flooding where we little ants were going to die in the flood. And so we just sort of cling together. And that's what the TLC became and still is. And so it's fundamentally a network of relationships. And then in 2020, I had to pivot what had been a growing network of Jordan Peterson meetup groups, because the Jordan Peterson conversations were bottoming out. So that's when we developed the estuary protocol and pivoted that whole network into networks of estuary groups, which were in some ways in-person communities of some of what we were doing online. And it's similar to, I'd seen different ministries do pub ministries and that kind of thing, but there's no end to listening to really smart people talk about whatever topic you want on YouTube. What there was a shortage of is having someone care enough to listen to you. And so when it comes right down to it, both Estuary and the TLC are much more about being heard than talking. And that then what I had done early on pastorally really began to make sense, because people basically were watching videos of me listening. And that was the key thing, that here's a real life person who is listening to me. And now I can't listen to everyone because, again, the internet is too big, but everybody needs someone who will listen to them. And I had known that pastorally for years before, because very quickly you learn that the main thing people would walk out of my office with was usually that the pastor cares about me because he sat and he heard my story. Now, maybe I'd given them a little nugget or something, but also you learn as a preacher that most of what people leave the sermon with, for most people, is something that connects in with them, because you have people at the end of the sermon say, "Pastor, that point that you made, that really, that really touched me." And I'd say, "Well, what point?" And then they'd tell me, and it'd be like, sometimes it's like, I would never say that because it's just heretical or wrong or
Yep.
what have you. But that's the point that touched them, because obviously, in a Vervaekian way, in this transjective way, something I said prompted something in them, and an insight developed, and it was helpful to them. And so the TLC is
Okay,
in many.
okay. Yeah,
Go ahead.
let me just throw something in here. I'm a big believer in Lectio Divina. And when I teach Lectio Divina, one of the first things that I tell people is during the course of Lectio Divina, you're going to be getting things that are not exegetically valid out of the text. But I am not about to tell the Holy Spirit what he can or cannot do with his own word. So I mean, I get things out of Lectio that I would never teach. I would never preach them,
Yeah,
not out of that text at least, because they don't come from the text
yeah,
per se.
yeah,
But that's where the Holy Spirit leads you to. And
yeah,
that's what's so critically important in Lectio. It's a way of hearing the voice of the Spirit.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and it's the same kind of thing when you preach. People will hear things that you never said.
Yep, yep, yep. No, that's right. So the TLC is in many ways, it because it lives in an attention economy, it is the coin of the realm in the TLC is attention. But it's not about YouTube metrics. It's about via YouTube gaining attention from someone and actually being able to build a relationship. So then the estuary conferences were sort of a natural outcome of that, because then at the estuary conferences people can meet the people and deepen the relationships that they're building online. And so the TLC is basically an attention economy, but it's fundamentally about listening.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You know, I used to teach uh, communication things in some of the Colson meetings, and one of my rules of communication is people the thing that people crave the most and are missing the most in their life is people who will listen.
Yeah. Yeah.
So listening is really what's critically important. You know,
Yeah.
that's one of the principles that I would articulate. And I think that that's exactly right. You
And
know,
and then friendship. And
mhm,
so you'll find in some channels, and most of the channels in the TLC are very small, but the, people are making friends. And especially for men right now, and one of the things I had heard something, some study that, because evangelicals are always studying themselves, um, evangelical ministers tend to be men and they tend to have very few friends.
mhm,
And I think men in general tend to have few friends. And I think, part of that is the way careers have developed. Part of that is the way marriage is working in our culture. And so part of what the internet can do is help people make friends using these tools. And that's what's happening. Now, I fully expect at some point we're going to have some catastrophes because I've been around churches long enough to know that if you have enough relationships developed, there will be catastrophes. And but you can't not develop an environment, an arena which is rich in the capacity and potential for friendship, um, and not realize how needed that is. And it is one of the most needed things I think there is today. And so basically everything that I'm doing in terms of the TLC, in terms of estuary, this is all basically about trying to create an environment where people can find each other, build relationships, and through those, and of course, friendship was a huge theme, obviously in Lord of the Rings, but also for Lewis. Um, and and men need it right now. They really do. Women do too, but generally speaking, women do better at that than men for a whole host of reasons. So
mhm.
that's part of the reason the TLC skews so male.
Yeah, yeah. I pay. I'm not exactly in the manosphere or anything, but I do pay attention to that, and that is one of the things that is really obvious is the lack of friendship and just how really serious that is to the male psyche. You know,
Yeah,
what a real wound that leaves.
yeah, yeah. It was. We have a estuary group every Sunday morning at 9 o'clock here, and it's it's usually sort of 60-40 male female. My channel skews it a little bit because I'll often get people come in, but no, it's a deep hunger. And then for a space, I think, part of what you discovered with your podcast is that there's men also like to get really nerdy and wonky about all kinds of things. And so the TLC is pretty nerdy and wonky. And the other thing that was important for the TLC is it's sort of relationship first. And so, I have other friends in much more Christian silos who always say, well, that's Vanderklay and all his heretics. So we got a lot of heretics in our crew, which to me is interesting. At our estuary meeting this Sunday, two guys came in, both of whom uh, are members of the Unification Church, Reverend Moon's church, and
Oh
both
yeah.
of whom were married in one of those Madison Square Garden things like 30, 40 years ago. And they're still married. And of course, you walk into an estuary group and people catch whiff of that. It's going to be like, you're gonna have to tell me more about this arranged marriage and all of those kind of things. So it's it's just a lot of fun. It's just a lot of fun, and I've been richly blessed by it. And I know a lot of churches will look at estuary and the TLC and they'll say things like, well, does this really pan out and pay off in terms of committed church, conversions and committed church memberships and stuff? It's like we've seen, especially in those early Peterson years, we saw with our Discord, we had a real problem in that so many people were becoming Christians that we were losing credibility because we didn't have enough atheists around. So I do sort of always try to lean towards keep it open, make sure you're really friendly for the heretics and the non-believers, and you have to keep that door open. Otherwise, you'll become a really nice Christian club, but we've got lots of those. So we need more people that are open. So that's part of the reason that we do what we do. And I sort of categorize Christian YouTube. Christian YouTube has a lot of gatekeeping and theology sniffing. And, you can develop a big following if you just always, leaning into these purity spirals. But I think that's actually quite counterproductive. And I am way more interested in all of the strange people in the world. So,
Yeah, one of the books I wrote, actually with a missiologist, one of the things we really hammered is that churches tend to use the wrong metrics. Yeah, the metrics are always the ABCs: attendance, buildings, and cash.
yep, yep,
We've got several other abbreviations for them that are less polite.
yep.
Um, but but that's not that's not what the church is about.
No.
The classical image is that the church is a hospital for sinners.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you aren't acting as a hospital, you're not doing your job.
Yeah. 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 Well,
So,
it's very true. So yeah, the TLC is this weird thing that's floating out there on the internet. And I know that when, you'll find them invading comment sections sort of like fire ants sometimes, like they did the podcast when I was on there. It's very quickly a whole bunch of TLCers are in there. And it's in concentric rings too. There's a smaller group of fairly hardcore people who will see a lot and see almost everything. And then it goes out from there. I mean, that's basically human community. So yeah, that's the thing. And I've been tremendously blessed by it. I really have. It's been it's interesting because my father, I can't say that any of the three of us, Hiram or Stan or Paul, these three Christian Reformed ministers, three generations of us were tremendously successful in the ways that churches have measure success in that way. But I think actually all three of us have been very successful in ways that we have valued because it's most definitely been impact in people's lives and relationships. And I still will hear stories of my grandfather, and he was kind of a boring preacher. He would pray too long. My grandmother would sigh when he would pray before meals because he'd just go on too long. But I will still catch stories of people who, oh, he was my favorite minister. Well, why? He was a boring preacher. He prayed too long, but he was kind and he cared about people. And that people remember, especially in a world where there's so little caring. So, yep, that's TLC. For whatever, however long it won't. And some people have always, oh, I want the TLC should grow. And it's like, if it's anything like anything that my father or my grandfather or I have done, internet wise, it might look big if you imagine it. Wow, you got 33,000 subscribers. Wow, that number doesn't really mean anything. You said, well, you got, a few thousand people can show up. You can do big conferences. Yeah, but internet wise, that's still very small potatoes.
mhm.
But
Yeah.
to me, the thing I look for is that people do begin to care for each other and
Mhm.
do that well.
Yeah. Well, that's, when I talk about 15, 16,000 on the podcast, it's a big number,
Yeah,
but in the internet, that's nothing.
yeah,
How many
yeah,
does Joe Rogan get?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I
No,
mean,
yeah.
so but the important thing is that you're carrying out a ministry that nobody else is doing. And there's
Yeah.
obviously a need for it.
And that surprises that's I mean, it surprised me right away with the Jordan Peterson stuff, and it surprises me now. And I look at this with some colleagues, and they're like, "Well, I'd really like to connect up on the internet, and I'd like, oh, I got a network, jump in, just go ahead. There's no barrier to it." But if you're looking again just to grow a big audience, well, then you should just go out there and pick your little ecclesiastical silo and be a barking dog and figure out how to be sharper and meaner and purer than anyone else, and then you're going to drive up the numbers. But I don't know. I have no interest in that. So no, you're right. I don't know why more people aren't doing it, because to me it's not that hard. You just gotta, why not? Why not? It's, you're not going to get rich doing it. You're not going to get famous doing it. Yeah, maybe internet famous, but
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, yeah. So where do I begin?
Well, I think you
You,
are,
you talk
yeah.
about jumping in. Where do I jump in?
Well, you have jumped in because you said yes to me. And then, so you will probably get some more invitations. So say yes to them. And then, well, do you have a YouTube channel all by yourself or not?
I've got my it rarely used ministry
Oh,
YouTube.
I'd say,
It's mostly I've used it mostly for teaching videos, and I haven't had a lot of time to do that.
yeah,
So,
yeah. Well, it so one of the guys, Mark D. Parker, I always say Mark D. Parker because if you put in Mark D. Parker, then you can find him on YouTube instead of all the other Mark Parkers that are out there. But he's about our age, lives in Redland, California, and he's figured out a way to sort of jump in. And not everybody can sort of do monologue or commentary videos like I do. You probably could, because you could just make videos about whatever you're interested in. But then it's just participation. And so, I'm having you on now. You'll get a chance to be on some other things. I can get you on some Friday estuary groups. And a lot of it is sort of figure out how to participate, figure out what level participation works for the rest of your life. So part of the reason this works for me is I needed, just as a pastor, so most of the people in all of none of the people in my church before I started this watch my videos even now. Some of the people who have come to my church because of the videos, yeah, they watch my videos, but nobody else watches my videos.
yep.
But I always knew as a pastor, I read things that nobody in the church would read. I'm interested in things that nobody in the church is interested in. And part of what I needed to do was process that with someone else. And because I have no one to process any of these things with. And, it's a classic problem that academics or semi-academics have. And so the internet works out kind of well for that. So I did listservs and I did blogs. But then I found that for me, I just needed to talk about some things. And then I just talk about those things. I just put the video out on YouTube and people would watch. But then again, the key thing was then be open to talking about those things with other people.
Mhm.
And then another thing that came into the TLC that sort of had it level up again was sort of these live streams. So like Mark Parker, he's not clergy, he's got a really interesting story and background, but he began to understand what I was doing, and so he started doing live streams where once he got his channel up into a certain point, in fact, he was streaming before we started. And then with StreamYard, you can drop a link, then other people come in to have conversations. And it's just a matter of building relationships. So if you want to participate, I think probably Christian Baxter will ask to have a conversation. I think, Sam Tiedemann, who's our highest profile corner Unitarian, he'll probably want to talk to you about Connecticut and the UCC a little bit and your experience there. Um, so it's just sort of a matter of saying yes, participating, and then finding a way to play that works for the rest of your life.
Mhm.
So Mark Parker and Jacob Federecci can do a fair amount of live streaming because that's kind of the way their life is ready now. Others do more Substack things. Um, Others, maybe start a local estuary, and it might depending on again what the rest of your life looks like, a local estuary might be a thing to do if you're trying to get some stuff going locally. So it's just a matter of seeing the tools that people are using and finding maybe a niche that fits for you and then starting to connect with people. It's not unlike what you've probably done all your life, just by the fact how you wound it up with on the theology podcast. Same kind of thing.
Mhm. Okay. Yeah. Um, I've thought about at least lurking in some of the estuary conversations, just to sort of see how they go. Um, the trick is finding one to lurk in. I mean, yeah, that's.
Well, one of the things you could do, so estuaryhub.com, if you go there and you basically say, I sign up for ElseNet, what you'll get then is an invitation throughout the month. There are different, these aren't streamed online, but they're just on in Zoom rooms.
Mm,
But what they
okay.
do is they're just basically estuary conversations of people who want to learn how to do the estuary protocol, which can take 3 minutes to learn, actually, especially if you have small group experience. And but that'll sort of get you plugged into that ElseNet network and say, okay, well now I sort of have the hang of this estuary thing. Um, See, part of the difficulty is that when people look at the TLC, they'll usually find my channel, but my channel is sort of a visible element of things that actually have a lot of layers. And
Mhm.
again, it's not unlike a church because churches have all these layers too. You have the women's Bible study person over there, and you have the Sunday school teachers there, and you have the deacons and the elders, and it's all this layered stuff. And so there are more layers to the TLC than are necessarily visible on my channel. And the more you sort of play around and poke around and say yes to this or try that, the more you'll begin to sort of get into the network. And it is a network of networks. And so then often what happens is people then sort of carve out their own little sub node network as part of the bigger network. So you've got Grail Country and you've got Grim Grizz and you've got Kale Zeldin and you've got Luke Thompson and you've um I'll send you a link to a blog post that I made just to give some links of let's say YouTube channels that you can subscribe to. And then, but again, it has for what I tell people is number one, it's find something that you would do whether or not anybody will ever pay attention to it, because then you won't stop because you just do it for your own joy. And then find something that sort of fits into your own life and schedule so that it's enhancement and not just another thing on your to-do list. You don't want that. There's got enough things on that list. You want something that, hey, I've got a half hour right now. I'm going to look over here. Oh, something's happening over here, and that's tends to be where most of the people sort of use it to fill spaces until it becomes important enough that they actually start to make space for it.
Mhm. Okay, makes sense.
Well, I'm about at my time, and I got Monday mornings are always tricky because it's like, how's this week gonna go? And then you get two phone calls, and it's like, I know what I'm gonna be spending a lot of time on this week. So,
Well, in my case, it's shoveling snow. We got 16 inches and we've now got a winter storm warning coming.
16?
Yeah, over the weekend.
Ooh, well.
Lake
Um,
effect. We're in the lake
yeah,
effect zone.
yeah. That'll do it. Well, Glenn, well, let people know how they can find you so that, if they want to invite you on something or have questions for you or want to look at your Substack.
Mm.
So
Yeah,
sounds like you've got a few ways.
my Substack's easy. It's Glenn Sunshine. Just spell
Okay.
Glenn with two N's and you'll find it.
Okay.
Um, my website is e square inch, ESQUAREINCH. Just write it out, esquareinch.org. You can get to me through that. Um, or you can just email me directly. It's Glenn with two N's dot sunshine at Gmail. So any of those are fine.
All right. Super. And you're on Twitter, and that's just Glenn
Um,
Sunshine as well on
yeah,
Twitter.
on Twitter, on Facebook.
Okay. Okay. Super. Well, thank you, Glenn. This has been, I loved hearing your story. You told it well. And yeah, just the fact that you're interested, I think people are going to reach out and they're going to want to, they're going to have their own little peculiarities of your story they connect with, and
I
in
would
they
hope
go.
so. I would
All
hope
right.
so. All right.
All
Thanks so
right.
much for having me.
Yeah. Thank you, Glenn. Take
Okay.
care.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.